I'm David Bush, Executive Director of Preservation Houston. Thank you for being with us for our program on the House of the Century. If you're a member of Preservation Houston, thank you for your support. Free access to these programs is one of your member benefits. If you're not a member, I invite you to join online at preservationhouston.org/join. I'm also happy to welcome the members of our program partners, Houston Mod and the Society for Commercial Archaeology. Tonight's program is part of the Bart Truxillo program series, named in memory of the pioneer preservationist and Preservation Houston co-founder, and supported by donations from our members and friends. If you'd like to help fund online and in-person programming or make a donation in memory of Bart, please visit preservationhouston.org/donate. Preservation Houston is supported in part by a grant from the City of Houston through Houston Arts Alliance. Now I'd like to turn things over to Preservation Houston Programs Director Jim Parsons, who will introduce our speaker.
Well, thanks, David, and thanks to everybody who is joining us this evening. I want to start by going back to our program partners that David mentioned, Houston Mod and the Society for Commercial Archaeology. You're going to want to check out both organizations if you're not familiar with them. Their websites are houstonmod.org and sca-roadside.org. We are happy to be among the presenting partners for an exciting Houston Mod event that's coming up November 9th, focused on the work of the noted modern architect William F. Cody, and you can find more information about that on Houston Mod's website. And when you visit the SCA website, you'll find upcoming virtual programs looking at roadside architecture, as well as free recordings of past programs, including a really fun talk that Greg Smith did this summer about roadside Texas. We were pleased to partner with SCA on Greg's presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to find more ways to collaborate in the future. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Lamster, our first presenter for the evening. He is the architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News, a professor in the architecture school at the University of Texas at Arlington, and a Loeb Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. In addition to his articles and essays in the Morning News, you'll find Mark's writing in other newspapers and journals, including Architect, Architectural Record, and Metropolis. And if you're not already familiar with it, you should look up his excellent biography of architect Philip Johnson, which is called The Man in the Glass House. Mark last joined us in 2018 to talk about that book, and I am glad to have him back tonight to discuss the House of the Century. So Mark is going to kick things off with an overview of the house, and Mark, take it away, and I will join you again in a few minutes.
Jim, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to Preservation Houston for hosting this event on one of the most remarkable, idiosyncratic, weird, amazing, funny works of architecture in our state, or really in any state or anywhere. The House of the Century, built in 1972 by Ant Farm, the collective known as Ant Farm. And the title of the house is telling, the House of the Century, very futuristic title, really suggesting it's in space-like, spaceship-like, and futuristic, biomorphic nature. And of course, now looking back, the House of the Future is actually the House of last century. The House of the Century, excuse me, is the House of last century. And that presents us preservationists with all kinds of dilemmas and questions about what to do about this amazing work of design. So as Jim suggested, I was going to just introduce you to the house a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen here. And you can see this house, which to call it a house is even, I don't even know if you can call it a house. It is a thing, an amazing, amazing thing. It is on a private lake about 45 minutes to the west of Houston, in a small town called Angleton. And it's on this artificial lake surrounded by a marsh, and basically completely inaccessible. And don't try and access it, because if you're going to try and access it, your odds of getting attacked by an alligator, giant spiders, a caretaker with a gun, snakes are more likely than you would enjoy. But as you can see, it's this very idiosyncratic, unique structure with essentially two bulbs surrounding on either side of a mast. The entry is this sort of plexiglass runway structure you have here on the left. It is now, that part of the house is now gone, and this is what it looks like today. So you might say a giant relic. What exactly does it look like? Maybe a schnoz. I don't know. You can choose your own thing. We'll look at another angle that has a more suggestive reading. At the top, you can see that little mast, which was for lights and video cameras and other things to look out on the world and spy. So who commissioned this? How did this thing happen? And you can see here the woman who was the client. Her name is Marilyn Oshman. If you're from Houston, you may be, or Texas, anywhere, you may be familiar with the Oshman sporting goods empire, which I guess doesn't exist anymore. But Marilyn was the daughter of the founder of Oshman's. And as she grew up and became a young woman, she was extremely, she had a family, but she was extremely interested in the arts. And she was very unusual in Houston. She was quite a radical and interested in radical arts. And you can see her here actually in 2019 next to the house. So we have a Oshman in her youth and Oshman today with the house as kind of a relic. So Oshman was working at the Contemporary Art Museum as a volunteer one day in about 1968 when these scraggly fellows came in and no one else really wanted to talk to them, but she decided she would. And as it turned out, they were Ant Farm, this collective of architects who were interested in doing radical underground architecture. And here you can see their Cadillac Ranch, which was built in a few years after the House of the Century out in Amarillo. And another project for which they are now quite famous was the Media Bird in 1975, where they drove a souped up car through a stack of television, the sort of commentary on the space age, on consumerism, on the media. Exactly what it meant, not really clear, I think, even to them, but it sure was an amazing spectacle. And so they called themselves Ant Farm because they were doing underground architecture, and an ant farm is kind of a radical work of underground architecture in itself. So it seemed like a natural title for their sort of group. And they were about as close to rock and roll as you could be architects. Oshman actually commissioned them to do a few earlier sort of projects that showed in Houston and sponsored them. And in 1972, decided to commission them to build her a vacation, or I guess a weekend retreat about an hour from her home in River Oaks. And this is what they came up with, this crazy bulbous thing. Very inspired by Buckminster Fuller and his ideas of biomorphic design, of living off the land. All of these themes that were current in that moment, they were very connected to the Whole Earth group. They actually had done a project for Stuart Brand, the founder thereof. And so they started building this crazy house, this that here, I guess you can see it looks sort of very nose-ish. It's concrete, sprayed concrete on a wire frame. And here you can see it further under construction. And here are some of the guys. Literally, they were radical. They were upside down, quite literally. So here you can see them quite literally hanging out at the house. So that eventually became this pristine white object on the horizon. And you would approach it as they would later, do the media burn. Here there was a whole slew of TVs laid out on the lawn, like little ducks on a pond, except there were televisions. So the whole experience of approach was already establishing a sort of sense of weirdness with the house. When you got inside, it was these biomorphic shapes. Everything turned into everything else. The walls were padded. All of the furniture was built in. Here you can see them at a built-in dining table, which is you have to sort of walk down into it and sit in this sort of pit. Again, a very contemporary kind of idea at that moment, radical. This is the bathroom upstairs, and you can see the ladder on the right in this picture that was taken in 2019, and you can see sort of where the house started and where it is now. So as I was saying, you might say it looks like a nose from one angle, and there are other readings that this image suggests. I won't belabor the point here, but it is what it is. Here, again, a recent photo, 2019, and you can see it's just become, from this icon of white purity, it's become this sort of dilapidated structure, decaying. This is what those insides look like now. I remember when I went there in 2019, it's it was covered in spiders and quite nasty looking to go in there. This is what that ladder up to the top looks like. Very tricky to climb up that ladder. Was it a house that you could genuinely occupy? Was it useful? Well, it's not a real home. It was always more of an art piece, I think, than something that a family could use productively. But they did love it. They loved going there on the occasions when they chose to do so. Here's the view at the top. And here we have what it looks like out along the shore. It's incredibly beautiful object. So you now have a brief introduction. I didn't want to go on and ramble on too long here, as I am wont to do, but I thought it would be nice to give a little visual introduction to the house for those who haven't been there or seen it at all. So with that, I turn matters back over to Jim to lead our discussion on this unique work of architecture.
I mean, I thought we were going to be talking about an interesting building. I mean, what is there to say? It's unlike anything you've ever seen before. Mark, I appreciate that. That was a good kind of House of the Century 101. And we are going to be getting deeper into the story here as we go on. I will say, if you're not familiar with this building, there are a few places that you can go to learn more about it than what you've just heard. Mark wrote an article about the house in the Morning News in 2019, The Epic Tale of the House of the Century, which is a great read. You can also visit architect Richard Jost's website, richardjost.com, and Richard has narrated some YouTube videos about the house and kind of gets into aspects of its construction and its design and where it came from. But tonight we have something even better than a Richard Jost YouTube video. We have Richard Jost himself, and I want to do a brief intro here for this special guest. Richard, as I said, was the architect of the House of the Century, and he can talk to us a little bit more about what Ant Farm did and what he did. Richard began work in 1970 as an architect and contractor in Houston. He has been working in southern New Mexico since 1985, and his designs have earned awards and international acclaim. And I should mention for Houstonians, especially those of you who are college basketball fans, Richard came to Houston on a basketball scholarship and played for the University of Houston Cougars under legendary coach Guy V. Lewis, which I think is an interesting side note to the story. Nothing to do with the House of the Century, but it's a great story. So Richard is joining us tonight from his home in New Mexico. And Richard, whenever you're ready to come on, we'll be happy to have you. And I want to say thanks to Steve Curry of Houston Mod, who made contact with Richard and invited him to be here this evening. And I will remind everybody, as we go into the discussion here, send those questions in via chat or via Q&A, and we'll be happy to take as many of those as we can.
Hi, Richard.
Richard. Here we go.
Hi, Richard.
Howdy.
Hey. I think since we do have people joining us from all over the country, it would be good to talk maybe a little bit more about the site and the location of the house. Mark, you did a great job of kind of explaining it's on this lake near a small town, 45 minutes outside of Houston, just on the very flat Texas Gulf Coast plain. Is there anything else that either of you would say about the location, or I guess the question is, why was this location chosen?
Well, this was Marilyn's. Marilyn and Judy, her sister, had this lake, and that was Mojo Lake. That's what the M-O-J-O is, Marilyn Oshman, Judy Oshman. So that was the original site, and that's from the very beginning. That's where her retreat was to be built, on Mojo Lake.
One of the interesting things about it is her sister actually built a house, also built a house there. It's the neighbor, and it is a very conventional, it's very nice, but it's a very conventional house. So one of the realities of what has happened over time is that, and even at the beginning, was that when the family went to go stay at the House of the Century, they actually would spend time in the House of Century, have parties in the House of the Century. The kids loved to go and hang out there and drink and and Marilyn herself was quite the entertainer. So many celebrity and fueled parties would take place there with members of the Houston arts community and beyond. But after they were done drinking in the House of the Century, they would go stay in the not house of the house of the moment, or I guess the house of whatever you want to call it, but the sister's house.
That I remember reading, and Mark, it might have been in your article that it was a fun place to be, but it wasn't a place that you would want to live, which,
Yeah, that's true.
And you can kind of understand.
Climbing up a ladder before you go to bed is one of the objections.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about how Richard became involved, because obviously the house was sort of the dream of Doug Michaels and Chip Lord, who are the architects at Ant Farm, and they created this imaginative, wacky, wonky structure. But then they realized they had to figure out how to build the darn thing, and they weren't really practicing architects at that moment in any really sober kind of way. Sobriety did not actually contribute a lot to this project, I would say. So Richard, maybe you'd like to fill us in a little bit about how you came to know them and became involved in the making?
Well, a YouTube video explains it pretty well, I think. Doug and we had met back in, I think, 69 or something like that. And this was a time when I was just graduated from college. I just got married. My wife and I had a pickup and a trailer full of tools. We lived in 10 residences in 1 year, going from Colorado. I got on a construction team in Colorado. Got tired of that, went out to Bakersfield, California. My brother's a builder there. I picked up a couple of jobs that he didn't have time to. So it was just a carefree time, traveling all around the country. And while I was out there, I got in touch with Doug Michaels, and he invited me to come out to California and spend some time with him. And when I was out there, he told me about Marilyn and this prospective project that may come up, and asked me if I wanted to join the team. And since I had so much building experience, I mean, I already built 2 houses on Lake Travis after I graduated from college. Between college and the time I met with Doug, you know, I was building. That's what I do. Design, build, architect, construction. That's what I do. So when I met with Doug, he showed me the model, a little clay model that he made. And again, on YouTube explains it pretty well. And I looked at it, I said, wow, that's pretty wacky. And I had no idea how to build it. So the project evolved. That's the best way to say it. It was an evolution of Doug's ideas and me trying to figure out how we're going to build it. And my word was simplify, let's get it simple, until it came into this, evolved into the model that we see now. And then when we had that model, then we started talking about ferro cement, and we did a little research on how boats were built. And we used that, pretty much that technology of forming the shape with pipe ribs and then putting the ferro cement shell around it. And so, I mean, what I can say is it evolved from that one little model into this amazing shell. And then we started to design the inside. And it was just a matter of working and designing and building it all together. It was never an idea and drawings that was put out for somebody to build. It never happened that way. It happened from the very beginning, design and building something that we could build. And one interesting story that I wanted to share was when we got the design award in Progressive Architecture magazine. The next issue, one architect wrote a letter to the editor and was a little peeved because they gave an award to a house that could never be built, because the drawings that Doug Michaels had did was just beautiful and amazing. And we got that, got the award, but they didn't think it could be built. The following issue, we had 5 pages of the completed model. And that's, we really like we did it at that time. So that's, that's how it happened, design and build.
I'm kind of curious to follow on that question. I would assume the basics of construction, you talked about studying how boats were built and the sprayed concrete and that kind of thing, but did you have to sort of make any techniques up as you went, Richard, or was it all fairly straightforward, just applied to an unusual build?
We had to improvise. And I don't know, at that age, in that time of my life, I had so much confidence I could do just about it. Bring it on. Let's see if we can do it. And I think with the ant farm and myself, we were able to bring this project to completion. It was just an amazing journey.
And the inspirations, I think we touched on a couple of them earlier, but I've read space, because the Apollo missions to the moon were happening at this time. Buckminster Fuller that Mark mentioned. I think somebody said automotive design. Gaudi was one of the influences. What do you think, Richard, in terms of where this design came from?
Well, a lot of it came from the 60s automobiles. if you look at the shape of the outside, almost like headlights, and the upholstery on the inside, and then, you had the feeling of the 50s, which is, it was a very, Ant Farm was very much into automobiles, like Cadillac Ranch, and this, I think that was the big influential thing, was the 50s automobiles.
I think when you look at one of the aspects of automotive design is how everything is taken in consider, right? It's an all over design, and so was the interiors are all compartmentalized, and that's very much a case with the house. The walls are padded. It's a completely a single design experience. Another, I think, important influence for them was submarines and boats. In the original, some of the original drawings, there were going to be parts of the house that actually went under the lake with these giant bubbles. And excuse me, later in their careers, one of the experimental projects that Art, as opposed to other Ant Farm projects, right? They were all experimental. One of their experimental projects was this sort of underwater pods that would be a scientific installation where humans and dolphins could communicate with each other.
Well, Ant Farm was involved with the dolphin embassy. I don't know if you heard that term. Dolphins, and the dolphin embassy was a big ferrocement floating vessel that allowed dolphins to come in and interact with artists and scientists. But that's the creative talent of Ant Farm, of Doug Michaels, Chip Lord, and Curtis Schreier. Those were the three heavies, and they were incredible. They just the ideas that came out of those guys, brought them to where they, the fame that they have.
I mean, one of the interesting things was that Doug Michaels, after Doug had become extremely close to Marilyn, and really the idea, they had this idea for a house, and then Doug took this trip to India, and then also traveling around the United States, sort of in that hippie kind of way that was endemic of that moment. And as he was traveling, Doug would periodically send drawings back to Marilyn, suggesting what this house could look like. And they were, each one was more and more extravagant than the next. They looked like sea monsters, and some looked like cars and blobs. And I think he was a wonderful, wonderful draftsman. These images are full of color and invention and hilarity, very much challenging the notions of what a house could be, what it meant to be stable, both physically and also, in terms of culturally or aesthetically or mentally. So they were, go ahead, Richard.
Working with Doug Michaels was just an amazing experience. His influence, just the way I look at projects and do things, and the amount of energy he had. We would talk about ideas in the evening, at night, and in the morning he would have drawings. He would just let everybody know what his ideas, and it would be coming out every day, more design, more ideas. And I know, of course, there's ideas that he's talked with Marilyn, about the house. We don't have any clue how many different ideas, but the communication between Marilyn and Doug was so important to make this thing happen, because she did have confidence in Ant Farm, even though they were wacky artists. For some reason she went along with it. She came out to to Austin and went through the 2 houses that I built out there, because she had to have a feeling of confidence in somebody that could build, whatever Doug or Ant Farm designed. And I think on that trip, she did have confidence that it could happen. So, I just kept right on, going on the ride, not knowing where it would lead. My wife went back to, she had 1 more year at the University of Houston. We were traveling, like I say, we lived in 10 different residences in 1 year, traveling all around. And this just fit right in, with my schedule. We lived in Angleton, and she commuted to Houston, University of Houston, to get her degree. And we had our first child right there, while we're doing the House of the Century. It was an incredible experience that, it's influenced my life.
I really want to emphasize how important Marilyn was in giving this group the freedom to invent. It's really just extraordinary. She wanted a vacation house, but she was really more interested in supporting and interesting and exciting design. And, she was a radical and was willing to live with it. I think she really enjoyed it. And so unusual in Texas and Houston and River Oaks, right? There's a very conservative community. She was friendly with Dominique de Menil. Again, also like a young Jewish woman. So someone, out a little bit part of the mainstream, but also willing to challenge it. She's also, in the past, in addition, she started with the House of the Century, or actually she started with earlier projects with Ant Farm, graduated, I guess you could say, to House of the Century, but she's continued over the years to sponsor events, the Orange Show. She's instrumental in preservation of the Orange Show, the Art Car Parade. So she's really, I think, been an important figure in bringing creativity, radical ideas, and open-mindedness to the arts community in Houston. And I think that's really important. And Richard was talking about what a fun time and propitious moment this was when they were building it. I'd love to hear some more stories about, hanging out, eating barbecue, living adjacent to this house as it was going up. There was definitely a lot of alternative substances being used at that moment. I know by the Ant Farm guys, at least. I don't think a really one of my favorite anecdotes about I heard from, I forget it was Chip Lord or Marilyn, who told me that one day one of them came and said, asked her if she wanted to turn on, and she replied that the light switch was down the hall, which was, I thought, a great. She was happy to let them be them.
That's a very River Oaks kind of answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I'm sure that there are a lot of stories about what it was like to build this place. One, I love the picture. I think that was you in the picture, wasn't it, Richard? Where the two, was that you and Doug that were upside down?
Yes.
Yeah. Which kind of tells you a lot.
Well, there was other pictures too that we had. I don't know if you've seen the one where Doug was up on a ladder and we put a big piece of canvas over him so he looked like he was 10 feet tall. That's another iconic photo. But yeah, it was fun and games. The whole, the process, the building, the community. Chip and his girlfriend and Karen and I, we lived in a house in Angleton, which was like, I don't know, 5 or 10 miles away from the job. So yeah, it was a great experience.
I have a couple. We're getting some comments and questions in. I wanted to say, let's see. Gary Cunningham points out that the Beatles' Yellow Submarine was released in November of 1968, which kind of fits in with this whole time period and the culture that was going on. I guess you could call the house of the century a white submarine if you wanted to, but it sort of all goes together. And Mark, I'm sorry to say you misrepresented where Angleton is. It's to the south and not to the west.
Yes.
I thought it was southwest or west southwest. It's not also to the west. It's directly south, isn't it?
Directly south.
Yeah, pretty much directly south.
Well, that's what happens when you bring a New York Jewish carpetbagger in to talk about something in Texas.
Well, we have a lot of apparently we have a lot of people watching who are strong on directions. So anyway, if you're going out to look for the house, which you shouldn't do, it's south and not west, but you still won't find it. Let's see, an interesting question, Richard, for you. This is from Steve, and I think it's probably Steve Curry. He asked, what did you guys call the project while it was underway? Was it always called the House of the Century? Did you refer to it as something else?
No, it was always the House of the Century.
Even in the drawings that Doug was sending,
You know,
they called it the House of the
I
Century.
don't remember exactly when. No, maybe Chip might remember that, but I don't know. In my mind, it was always the House of the Century, and you know, we were the nationwide builders. I don't know if you knew that. We had a registered name for our construction company called Nationwide Builders, and where that came from, it was the trailer that I had all my tools in was a Nationwide rental service. So it became Nationwide Builders.
What's an impressive name? It's a good name.
But, you know, but it was true. I mean, I've been in Vermont. I built a studio in Vermont. Went to Austin, built a couple of houses there. Went out to California, built some projects out there. So the next project was Houston, Nationwide Builders. So that fit.
Well, there you go. And to go back to something that you touched on a minute ago, Mark, for people who are in Houston will know this. People who are maybe not familiar with Houston may not, but this kind of this house and what Ant Farm was doing and all kind of fits in with the larger sort of weird and offbeat Houston art scene, which comes from the high and the low, which I think is interesting. When you talk about the Orange Show, it started out as this one guy who was just building a tribute to the Orange, who wasn't doing anything, super high concept artistic, but it's become a celebrated part of the local art scene. And I think that's interesting when you think about this as part of the larger art movement here.
Yes.
Oh, I think that's I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I saw the Orange Show right when I don't know what his name was, the guy that was doing the Orange Show. But when he
Jeff
died,
McKissick, I think.
yeah, when he died, was it Marilyn? Or I went out there because they were asking me to complete it. How much would it cost to complete the Orange Show? So I went out there and took a look at it, and I gave him, I don't know what figure I gave him, but it just kind of evaporated. Nothing happened. But I saw it before anything was actually established, what Marilyn had done with it. So, and the idea of the Orange Show, in a way, I feel myself is kind of in that mentality. I've got my own Orange Show project out here in New Mexico, and it's a hilltop with an observatory on it. And I'm working. That's my project now. That's what I'm working on. I'm developing, the hilltop, and it's bordered on two sides by national forests. So the wildlife can. This is the edge where humanity and the wilderness right there at my hilltop, and I've got water up there, and every day the water comes on automatically, and so you can hear it. All the animals in the area, there's birds that come in, there's deer, there's elk, we have mountain lions, and we have a camera set up so you can see what animals come in to drink the water, and it's incredible. And so I'm developing that at this time. And I say that's kind of like the Orange Show, because why am I doing this? It's just because I feel like doing it, and this is, it's important to me. And I know the Orange Show, I read his, he was saying, I think the main thing that he said was, eat oranges every day, live to 100, and be spry. That was his words.
Well,
So I don't, I'm not saying how to live. I'm just trying to live my own life.
well, I will say this, that there's something about Texas and the American West that has always attracted individualists, creators who want to be on their own, or invent something new. It's what attracted Donald Judd to Marfa. We've got The Hill in El Paso. Any number of Beer Can House, the House of the Future. There's something, obviously, there's a forces of conservatism and conformity in Texas, but it also, there's this contradiction, shall we say, that it's also always attracted this sort of free thinkers. And the amount of land there is here, open space, where there's opportunity to create these kind of projects, where there maybe isn't, sort of in the more claustrophobic zones of the Northeast.
And in Houston specifically, there's very rarely anybody to tell you no, because we don't really have any planning here in most parts of the city, and we don't have zoning. And if you want to build it, you can.
Exactly.
Which, for better or worse, but it makes for an interesting urban environment. I
would compare I also wrote a few years ago a story about the Steel House created by the artist Robert Bruno outside of Lubbock. I think also the same period, exploring a lot of the same ideas, that really a work of pure sculpture, but also biomorphic and object created by an experimental designer who could find a place to do his thing at his own speed in Texas.
Yeah. There's a spirit inside. I know that spirit because it's in me. It's like just another example is my thesis project. Most students were thinking about their career, graduating, where they're going to get their first job. I was building a 40-foot styrofoam structure for the Home Builders Convention. I completely dropped all my classes, focused on this one project. And to me, that was more important than my future. And I don't know where that comes from, but that's the way I am.
I mean, Jim, I think we should talk. This is Preservation Houston. So
yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say we have a whole lineup of questions along that line. So
okay.
So I'm glad that you're taking us in that direction. I want to kind of start. I want to take a couple of these questions to get us into the story, and then we can get into the preservation angle. One thing that has not been discussed is why was the house allowed to fall into disrepair? So if either of you want to take that.
Well, the first problem, and again, it's in the YouTube video, but the humidity and the environment out there in the swamps, it penetrated the exterior shell and was rusting out the staples that held the upholstery up. And the first sign that they saw there was a problem is the upholstery started coming loose. And so we got together. Marilyn hired an engineer to help us solve the problem. And they come up with a solution, and they gave it back to me to do it. And that's the moisture shield. And again, that's in the YouTube video. And basically it was completely scouring the whole shell with water blast, get all the moss and everything off, coating the whole thing with butyl rubber to make it waterproof, add 1.5 inches of polystyrene or polyurethane foam for insulation, and then put a 2-inch gunite shell over the top of that. It's like building a swimming pool over a boat. And that's so we did that. Now that effort was to save, the house of the century. But then they had this horrendous flood. The water level came up so high that it went inside and completely drenched everything. And the house actually held the water in there for years. So everything rotted out, all the wood rotted out. And that's why, you look at the photographs today, and it was because of the flood that ruined it.
I mean, Texas is a very, very challenging environment, and any kind of experimental project is always liable to take more damage. And when you compound the fact that this was always never a primary residence, but a sort of experimental place, never really a functional place. So when the repeated environmental damage, eventually, it was, I think, too much for the family, had other issues that it had to tackle. And it sort of became a relic, and it is a beautiful relic as it is now, but it leads all these, promotes all these questions. What do you do with it? Do you restore it? Do you leave it as it is? Do you leave it where it is? Does it need to be moved? There are a lot of challenges here. And the Oshmans have worked with some preservationists, but I think they're still trying to figure out what they need to do with what they want to do with it.
Yeah, I thought about that, and I thought, I think I talked with Marilyn about this at one time. And my idea was to actually cut it into 3 sections. And that, with a good diamond saw, you can just cut around the arches. So you have the tower, and then you have the dome on each side. And then just cut it right off flush with a slab. So I don't know how much weight the Sikorsky's helicopters can lift, but they could lift each one of those sections and put it over on the other side of the lake. I think the lake is divided up where Judy has one side and Marilyn has another. And it's right now, I think it's on Judy's side of the lake. I could be wrong, but that was one idea that passed.
Well, it's an interesting thought. And I've read the different proposals about leaving it as a ruin, moving it somewhere else, moving it elsewhere on the property, or potentially moving it to, a more environmentally safe location. And some people have also suggested replicating the house somewhere so that people can get the experience of going in, but, it might be more accessible. So I'm curious, between the two of you, what do you think should happen to the house?
Well, I'll let Richard answer, but one potential model was Paul Rudolph's Walker Guest House, which on Sanibel Island, this very fantastic, delicate little beach house created by Paul Rudolph fairly early in his career, in his Sarasota years, for the Walker family, who were from Minnesota, and had this vacation house in Sanibel Island, this little barrier island on the Gulf Coast of Florida, near what is now Fort Myers. And it has been subject to hurricanes for decades. It always survived quite well. Rudolph designed it with sort of environment in mind, but the problem there is that land became incredibly valuable, and it has since, once the family, the original builders had passed away, there was a question of what to do with it. They didn't want it, and they've sold the land, I believe, and the Ringling Museum, I think, sponsored a replica even before it was demolished. And I think now the idea that that exists has sort of allowed for the removal of the original, which to me is very sad. I don't really have any great answers for this. I'd like to see the thing remain where it is, perhaps as a ruin, but how can it be accessible there?
See, I don't.
Challenge.
If it were rebuilt where it is, there's no guarantee it will be flooded again, because the water came up high enough to go inside there was one port where the ventilation was like 2 feet off of the ground. The water level came up that high, so it was able to come in and just completely flood the place out. So if that building was, well, I just think it should just remain right where it is. But if it were to be moved, I think you would have to find out what the maximum load the Sikorsky helicopter can lift, and basically cut it up into sections and move it and put it back together again. And we're just talking about the shell, the interior, who's going to do that one? It's, this was a one in a lifetime happening, and it's never going to happen again. I'm glad we have good photographs and videos of the time, because it was magical. And I'm just, so happy that I was a part of it. But I don't know. I've heard a lot of people talk to me, and they say it's a shame that it's not the way it was when we finished. But that's life. Nothing ever is the same.
Well, I'm curious, Richard, and we did have a question that's along the same line. But do you think, and I think Mark kind of touched on this earlier, but do you think when the house was built, was Marilyn Oshman or Ant Farm, and were y'all thinking of it as a house? Were you thinking of it as a work of art? Were you thinking even in those terms? Or, I mean, what was, if you had to describe it, how would you describe it?
It's got air conditioning, or it had air conditioning, it had a stove, it had a double sink, it had a toilet, it has all the things that makes life comfortable in a house. The only things that Marilyn kind of complained about was going up the ladder to the master loft, and also not being able to open up the big window looking out to the lake. So I did come up with a possible retrofit that and it answered those problems. It was the big window, the big round window with kind of horizontal. That would be a hinge, and this thing would open out, so you could actually step out from the living room. And I actually have some people here where I live that are first-class metal builders. I had no problem with thinking that they wouldn't be able to do this, because they could. So I felt good about that. And but the part that I didn't feel would make it work is I wouldn't be living there. See, we were all living right there during the project, and for me to be in New Mexico and try to restore the house out there, I talked with Pete Eichenlaub, who was one of the crew members and architect, and but it just really, I'm glad that it really didn't happen, because I think it wouldn't have been as successful as what we had or what we did have. I think it's, it went through the process, its life, its fame, and then that's it. things have a lifetime. And the house of the century had it.
Let me add that first of all, it is just never it was never intended or really could be a fully functional house. The stairway to get up to the bedrooms.
Oh, wait a minute, it was more like a fun house. I mean,
yeah,
like I say, it was air conditioned. It had all the things a house had, but it was much more than that. I mean,
yes,
you know,
well, that stairway, that metal stairway to the metal stairway up to the bedrooms is terrifying and a challenge physically. And
yeah.
the truth, I mean, if we're asking why it spent so long, sort of almost, I think abandoned is the wrong word, but the truth is that Marilyn's husband did not like it. He was a more, I wouldn't know if you'd call him conservative, Harvard trained businessman. He was running the Oshman business, and this was Marilyn's project rather than his. And he never, I don't think, ever really loved, he may have loved the idea of it, but the idea of staying there and climbing up that stairway was untenable for him. So I don't think it could ever really survive as a family house, and especially when one of the members of the family was in active revolt.
Yeah. Well, you know, going up the ladder, kids loved it, you know.
Kids don't know better.
All the kids loved it. But
well, kids don't have to carry like kids are 50 pounds. It's easy to scurry up that thing when you're a little kid, but as an adult, it is a thing. But
as I said, the project evolved, and that was the only way we saw that you could really get up and down was the ladder.
You know, they have those cool little circular hydraulic elevators now that you could stick right in there and use to get up to the. There's ways around this, Mark.
Sure.
You know, I'd also made a comment on the YouTube video that you know, since the ferro cement shell, I don't know what shape it is in now. I mean, it's looking pretty bad, but I thought it'd be there for who knows how long. But the idea of just completely gutting the inside and making some changes and bringing it back to where it's usable again, you know, it's feasible, but doing it where it is now, you run the risk of that flood coming in unless you build something, you know. Well, just an idea just occurred to me, but one of the problems we're talking with Marilyn about you know, about the moisture coming in and destroying it. We proposed a greenhouse over the whole building, just a big glass structure to protect it from the environment, and it could be built so even though it flooded, you know, the house would be protected because you could build a retaining wall high enough that the water couldn't get in from the bottom. And, but that was just another idea that went by. But we built a model and we presented it to Marilyn. Hey, Marilyn, what do you think about this? And she didn't go for it.
We have a comment that I think is a good one on these thoughts. Cynthia Toll says, you could say that the Farnsworth house or the glass house are untenable as houses too, but it's great that they exist. And she says, a structure can transcend the notion of being a mundane living space.
There you go.
It's true. Yeah. Philip Johnson might argue that the glass house is totally tenable, but.
Well, I mean, the truth is that Johnson built the guest house adjacent to it, the brick house, so that wasn't so much of an issue. Yeah. But it's true. I mean, you could argue about whether, you know, he lived in it or not. It doesn't really matter. It's that like this was an exercise in ideas first, and you sort of living second.
And it is. I agree with Cynthia. It's great that it exists, and it's wonderful that we can talk about it. And as you said, Richard, it's great that those photos, it was well documented when it was built. And I don't want to necessarily go and hang out with the alligators and the spiders, but I would love to see it even as it is. But it's really interesting to hear about it and think about it and think about this as a one of a kind of the moment building.
That's why I think of it.
Is there anything that either of you want to add to any of this, or any parting thoughts as we kind of start to wrap things up?
I will say one of the, I think, sad things about our moment is that there aren't a lot of projects like this anymore. It was unique and very much of its moment. And I think we're a very commercialized, corporatized culture. The idea of doing a house for love, doing a house as an radical artistic project, I think that's something extraordinary and valuable. And the fact that there are all these people on this call and interested shows just how important that can be. And if there's anyone out there who's thinking about either building or commissioning someone to do some kind of work like this, a totally experimental, radical idea, I think that would be great.
Well, that time Ant Farm and myself were living a nomadic life. You don't see that much anymore. We were radicals. We were against the war in Vietnam. We were, demonstrating, and we were nomadic. So without those ingredients, this project never would have happened.
Really puts it in the moment when you think about it that way too. It is, we've said of its time, it's very much of its time in so many ways. Well, guys, thank you both so much for being here. It was a real treat to get to talk about this. I wish that we could all take a field trip, but we'll have to do it through pictures. And Richard, we've kept mentioning the YouTube videos. I am going to follow up with everybody with an email that will have the link to the recording of tonight's program, but I'll make sure to put links to those YouTube videos in as well, because they're great to watch, because Richard goes through and explains the design process and the construction and how it actually came together. You get to see some of those early models that he was talking about. I remember one that looked to me like a tree branch and one that looked like a piece of wadded up paper, and you think, how could you build that?
Well, there's another video, Mojo Relic.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the it's in the museum in New York, in the MoMA. That video, along with Doug Michael's drawings of the House of the Century, that's all in the permanent collection at the MoMA. So watch Mojo Relic also. That's also a YouTube video.
That's, I think, one of the great ironies of this project is that we're going to know it through video, which, of course, one of the two most famous projects that Ant Farm did was the media burn, where they drove a car through all these television sets, destroying them. So I'm not sure what that says. I think they were visionaries. Their work was.
I know what it says. I was talking with Doug when that idea came together. He just felt like crashing through a bunch of burning TVs, and they built the car to do it. It was a feeling he had. He'd never watched television. He just, that was his statement.
Well, there you go. And now we're reliant on them to understand their work. So there you have it.
Yeah, that's the ultimate irony right there, right? A couple of parting thoughts from the audience. Sue Duffield suggests that it could be an interesting 3D virtual experience project, which is something that, that we can do now, and that could be cool. And let's see, Cynthia Toll says she's thinking about the floods that we experience in Houston from time to time. She says, looking at my background, she could imagine the house on a giant pontoon floating up and down Buffalo Bayou back here. So you never know.
I vote for that idea. I vote for that. That's pretty
I
great.
would love to see it just go by right here and float back and forth toward downtown. That'd be great.
Sounds like a Vito Acconci project. I like that.
Well, thanks again, guys. We really appreciate y'all spending the time to talk about this project, and I hope everybody's going to go out and learn some more about it and visit Richard's website, read Mark's article. David, hello.
Hello. Thank you all for doing this. Good program. Thank you, Jim. Great job as usual. So thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to our speakers, and have a good evening.